Welcome back to Analysis. In the first part of the programme, we looked at the legacy and the progress made since the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in this part, we take a look at the future of the movement and of civil rights in Britain. George, you were saying that there were big differences between the states and this country. If you had to say what are the major civil rights challenges now for black people in Britain, what would you say they were?
I think the difficulties now is to do with, obviously, coming out of a recession. During the times when the recession really was biting, you would find that there was, when the cuts were happening, it was the community who, especially those in the public and service sector, were affected more. So, those things do happen. I think we still have issues to do with strong, disproportionate police stop and search among black youths. That's still a big issue. Some of the things that we cover, certainly, in the newspaper. So, those things still exist today, and they continue.
Esther, I mean, obviously the police force in the Metropolitan Police has been repeatedly now designated as an institutionally racist police force. Is that a major issue, or?
Yes, it is a major issue, and it has been for some time, some decades, in fact. There are other issues. We're looking at school exclusions. We're looking at the prison industrial complex. We have similar levels of disproportionality here in the UK, in that people of African and Caribbean heritage make up less than 3% of the population and 15 to 25 of the prison population. We have issues around...
Which is an amazing statistic, because people are familiar with it in the States.
Exactly,
They're not so
familiar, and we have to also look at what's happening around immigration, and that, the fact, because of impoverishment, many people from African and Caribbean communities and other minoritized communities end up getting involved with various types of trafficking, and so there are many so-called foreign nationals languishing away in British prisons as a result of these historical forces as well, and these push and pull factors. We have huge health inequalities. We're still dying younger. We're still having health conditions that we should no longer be having. And this is a huge reality. There's the economic disenfranchisement as well that we experience. And so, in fact, I would say that there has been, and it is argued that there has been a UK civil rights movement, if we want to look at it in that way. In fact, the famous Bristol bus boycott that took place in 1963, really to challenge the colour bar that prevented, workers coming from the Caribbean, working, so-called black people, working on the transport at that time. And so it is said that as a result of those boycotts and others, that helped to create the public pressure for the passing of the 1965 Race Relations Act, and then the second one in 1968. So there are huge, I think, challenges. And this is not just seen as, just about inequality or racism. In fact, it's sufficiently serious that the United Nations Working Group of experts on people of African descent made a country visit in October 2012 and have actually cited these incidents as grave concerns, linking it not only to just, post-war discrimination, but to the everyday legacies and continuing harms as a result of enslavement and forms of colonialism and the specific forms of anti-black or anti-African racism.
Raza, I mean, MPAC, your organisation, it's made a point of of adopting the kind of rhetoric of the civil rights movement, of the Black Panthers and whatnot. Is that an effective model, do you think?
Yes, definitely, I think, because the reason is what the Black Civil Rights Movement showed is a very clear thing, that what you can't have is allowing people to just languish in a sense of victimhood. You have to give them a demand to focus on, because once you have a demand, it creates a cause within the community, and that's what we've learned to follow on that too, that just as you had different leaders trying to give back black people their identity and focus on a demand, that's one thing that we want to do too, that it's for what you have is people feeling that they are oppressed or they're unequal, and it doesn't go any further than that. There has to be a demand, and that's one thing that we're looking to do too. And just as you had different leaders and different, you know, black groups and organizations and individuals working together, that's what we're doing as well, trying to get different groups and individuals together. You'd be shocked at the people behind the scenes who are meeting regularly to say that we as a community have to actually challenge inequalities and that struggle for the Muslim community's freedom. But also, I think another key thing is that going back to what was said earlier, well, Malcolm X and others, I'm a big fan of Malcolm X. Just that's always, you know, a great inspiration. Just because, and I think that's why people respect him so much. And others, that they just said it very bluntly what they thought about the injustices that they suffered. That they, such a big part of it was identity. And I know I keep emphasizing that, but it's because unless you have your own identity, it's formed by others. And it's and I think that's one thing that we need right now as well. If you look at when people talk about Africa, they just talk about it as just one massive landmass. It's the people with a rich tapestry and history and cultures, but it's just, oh, it's Africa. There's a lot more to it, and I think that's a big thing. That's why identity was so important, and that unless you don't know your own roots, don't know who you are, someone will always connect those dots for you and tell you who you are. And I think that's what the Muslim community also needs and is getting right now.
Well, let's move the discussion on a little bit to an issue, well, related to exactly that point, because, you know, when I became politically aware in the 1970s, you knew who the right and the racists were referring to, because the language of abuse was about colour of skin or supposed point of origin. But especially after the War on Terror, it became about religion. Now, how do you read that kind of transition, and how much, therefore, do you think of the traditional language of anti-racism and of civil rights is usable and applicable in that circumstance?
I mean, I take the view that it is applicable because you're talking about injustice, you're talking about profiling, you're talking about stereotypical assumptions being made, labelling individuals merely on the basis of their faith, as it was in relation to their race. And that is something that can be sort of taken up by faith groups in the Muslim community who are suffering in the same way that sort of black people are. You know, in the UK and the US, but I think we need to learn the lessons. You know, I think what we have to be sort of mature, and we need to look at what has happened with the movement. The system, some would argue, let's say capitalism, is very flexible, very adept at adopting people. So if you go to the main cities in the US, you've got black mayors, you've got a black president. For heaven's sake, you know, isn't that enough for you? That's what all the white guys say in the US, you know. You've got Beyonce, you've got, you know, Denzel Washington, you've got stars, so the image is there. You've got newsreaders who are black, sports stars who are black. Yeah. But that is just adopting a few people, creating this mirage, this image that there is equality when there isn't. So I think what we take from that is that it wasn't about just voting and having politicians in place. It was about the reality. And where the US civil rights movement has failed is that the legacy hasn't led to grassroots sort of organizations. You know, the NAACP, okay, it's hampered by funds, but everything was put into one pot, which was let's get into office, let's get our mayors, let's get our police chiefs. So you got a few individuals who the sort of totems, you know, but they weren't. It didn't change the reality on the ground for most of the people, and I fear that the same thing is in this country. Similarly, you know, we had Bernie Grant, we had the Boatengs, we've got the Diane Abbotts. Fantastic, you got black MPs in Parliament, you got representation. End of story. Whereas if you go to Brixton, you go to Peckham, you go to Toxteth, you go to Moss Side, the reality is there. And you know what? The youth now have no trust in the system whatsoever. If there was a time in my days of activism, I'm still active now, when something would, you know, there would be an issue and people would come out in the street, they would demonstrate, they would give their time and effort, but they were let down so many times. And all that happened was the Boatengs became MPs, gone to Parliament, became Lords. They're all sitting there nicely. Well, what happened to Cynthia Payne? What happened to her family? What happened to Tottenham? You know? So it's about creating that consciousness in the community and having strength in the community, not just creating a few leaders who are going to be elevated and adopted and then off they'll go.
Well, this is the fundamental question, because when Barack Obama says, you know, he says, I'm not cynical, people shouldn't be cynical. The reason they're cynical is because the first time round of the riots in the United States, white mayors sent the police in. Second time round, and subsequently, black mayors sent the police in. So, I mean, that's where there is the question that Esther's been, you know, raising a couple of times. The economic question here hasn't been addressed, and that's why there's still pools of people who are just unrepresented. That's the problem we face. Do you think?
No, it certainly is, and I think you're absolutely right. You know, I mean, the youths of today, they don't have the same gusto like the previous activists have. And I think that's why when you look at what happened in August 2011, when things broke out, one of the first things people were saying, well, it looked like there's another riot in Tottenham, like a black riot. But it turns out it wasn't. You know, so you know, I think these things are just amazing that they still continue today.
Well, I mean, that's one of the interesting contrasts, isn't it, with things that have happened in this country. I mean, you know, more than in the States, perhaps the rioting is a kind of multicultural activity in Britain to a greater degree. Do you think?
Well, yes, definitely. But ultimately, we have to assess what has been achieved. And we can see that many of those who were implicated have been locked up. You know, especially young people, where that's going to impact on their own life chances when they come out of prison. And for minuscule offences. Exactly. So I'm not saying that people shouldn't do that. I recognise, as Martin Luther King did recognise, that when people riot, it comes out of desperate situations, and what we have to do is address those underlying issues which make people feel we have no stake in this society. And if we have no stake, then we are going to do what we can in order to survive. And I think that's the bigger question. And I want to come back to that point, which I think is really key. What do we take from this, and the lessons, and also our own role in terms of the people who supposedly now can legally occupy political positions and so forth. We also have to look at ourselves and how have we utilised these opportunities. And what we're seeing is that it's the same old system, but it just has some black and brown faces there administering that same system. Exactly. And in fact, that whole struggle is now sometimes a struggle amongst ourselves. And the gatekeepers often are people that might look like us. And so we have to have, I think, that sharp analysis, but equally we have to look at the movements on the ground and look at the voice and the agency that is still there in the community, but just because they might not be in Parliament or they might not be strong business leaders, we're not recognising them.
Do you think there are emerging, you know, people who are become a focus for resistance in the way that there was at that time, and not just the names we know, but many others that are perhaps, you know, more deeply hidden in the Raza? Do you think those people are emerging now? Do you think those people are emerging out of the movement now, sort of identifiable people who are representing grassroots movements?
Yes, and yes, to some extent, but I still think that a lot more work needs to be done in terms of actually solidifying that narrative a bit clearer. I think I still see it sometimes seen as pockets of activism rather than actual. I think it doesn't tie into a bigger cause, and I think that's one thing that needs to be looked at. And also, I think going back to your point about Barack Obama, it's true that the narrative is, look, you know, we had a civil rights movement, and now we've got a black president. Therefore, we've made it, right? We've made it, guys. And it's, well, actually, that's not true, because there was always, is he really American? Let's see his birth certificate. There's so much of that. The fact that when John McCain was standing up against him, someone said, I'm not going to vote for Obama because he's a Muslim. And McCain goes, no, he's an all right guy. He's not Muslim. That kind of language, that kind of supremacist thinking is still there. And I think it's yeah, Obama's trying to say, look, I've made it, therefore we've all made it. Well, no, actually, it's not been made, and you just got to go out to look on the streets, and you'll see what the reality is for people. And I think that has to be part of the narrative that says that the civil rights movement, that narrative, part of it has been hijacked, and we have to take it, reclaim it, and say, no, no, the movement still goes on, the struggle still goes on, and it won't stop until there is equality, not just in terms of law, but in terms of actual identity, that someone who's white does not think they're better. Or little things, for example, if an Asian or black person is late, for example, that says, oh, you know what Asian and black people are like. But you'd never categorize white people like that. Well, why is that white privilege still around? Why is that not being countered? And I think that's one thing that still needs to take place. And it has to be a relentless focus. And when anyone tries to move away from that, saying, oh, look, but we've got a black president. No, no, come back to that point. There's still inequality. There's no progress made until there's complete equality.
I mean, one of the, I guess we shouldn't let a discussion like this go by without saying that one of the more remarkable things about grassroots political activism in this country in the last 10 years has been the mobilisation of the Muslim community behind the anti-war movement, which wasn't, you know, was an automatic thing, although I'm sure that it had resources in the kind of, you know, you're watching a colonial occupation take place, you come from a country where that was a reality. That was a remarkable moment. Do you think?
No, I mean, I think it is remarkable, and I think that it showed that if you engage in grassroots activism, then organisations will emerge, and I think that's where we've made the mistake. You know, the anti-racist movement here has been targeted and has been divided, and people have been adopted by the system, as Esther put it so eloquently. Yeah. You know, the gatekeepers look like us; they're in place, and we think that's an achievement. However, was our goal, was the goal of the people who gave their lives and struggled against injustice simply to get a share of the cake, or create a fairer system for all? And I think it was surely to create a fair system for all, irrespective of your race, because as being victims of that injustice and racism, you didn't want anyone to be treated in that way. And I think people lost sight of that. There's disillusionment. The youth today are disillusioned, and I think what we need to do is to get that grassroots activism, the communities, and make them understand that it's not simply about political office. It's not simply about becoming the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. If you had a black man, is that going to change stop and search on the streets? Does it mean that a black Caribbean heritage man isn't going to be picked up and seen as a criminal? Is that going to change the 25% of the female prison population who are from the same origin? I mean, that's shocking. That is uncivilized. How can we tolerate the fact that so many black women are in prison and we do not question the system that churns these people out and keeps them locked up? It is wrong, and we need to re-establish that relationship with the youth to show them that it's not simply about elevating individuals into office, it's about activism, it's about being independent, it's about creating a society which will lead to a better outcome for all concerned. And Muslims are making the same mistakes. Yeah. They are all joining the Lib Dems or Labour or Tories and, you know, getting lords and whatever, and they go and mayor's office and gold chains, even though it's not allowed for them to wear, walking around thinking, that's it, we've done it. It is not the case. There needs to be an association, a relationship of trust with the community for all, not just a few individuals, and then we will get that kind of consciousness that we need. Because at the moment, people don't want to even accept. You talk to young people, they don't sort of recognise racism until they get into the workplace, until they suffer from it, because it's been sort of eliminated from their kind of memory, from their minds. So it's a mirage, and we need to sort of erase that.
George, let's take two cases on either side of the Atlantic here, the Trayvon Martin case. They're a kind of mark of how far we haven't come, aren't they, really?
Well, definitely. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the Trayvon Martin case, there was definitely, the passion was coming back again about, was he picked on merely because of his colour? And yet, answer, yes, he was. And I wouldn't want to mix the Mark Duggan case to the Trayvon Martin case, because that to me, that's
because you think it was more complex.
Well, I think it's a more complex situation, but I think in terms of going back to the U.S. part about it was purely picked on the fact that he was a young fella, and then a person could go in court and get off the case simply because he was protecting himself. That was his defense of protecting himself.
Stand your ground.
Stand
And there's
your
another
ground.
case in Florida where a white guy shot somebody, black youth in a car, had loud music on, came around, shot them, and says, so used the same defense as George Zimmerman in that case, saying, stand your ground, it's allowed.
I find it interesting that it could be seen in a different way in terms of Trayvon Martin and Mark Duggan, because for me, any loss of life or any taking of life is wrong and is painful, and often, in these cases have been violations of not only those individuals but also the rights of their families. And with the Duggan case, what we have is a supposed jury saying that this is a lawful killing, and that's far more disturbing for me, because that gives it a degree of legitimacy, because it's supposedly a legal judicial process that we are supposed to adhere to. And that sort of structural inequality within the law that hasn't been repaired is actually causing, huge amounts of inequality and injustice that need repair, and in fact are some of the demands of the reparations movement. And so whether it's people in civil society or officers of the state taking a life, why is some life considered to be of less value than others? And that is the fundamental question that we haven't answered.
Well, on exactly that point, asked 50 years ago and before that, asked again today. We've run out of time. I'd like to thank my guests in the studio and, of course, you at home for watching. Please do tune in again for future discussions. And don't forget, you can keep up with this discussion by following us on Twitter at the address below, or by following the Islam Channel Current Affairs team on Facebook. Until next time, goodbye.